My parents called me a failure at Thanksgiving dinner until I asked then who paid for this dinner. Everyone froze, the table went silent, the sound of the ticking clock was the only thing left in the room. My mother's eyes widened like she had just seen a ghost. My father shifted in his chair pretending to cut the turkey again. Even though his plate was already full, I could feel the heat rising in my chest because this was the moment I had been holding back for years. Every Thanksgiving I would sit there listening to them brag about my siblings, the perfect ones, the successful ones, the ones who never disappointed them. But tonight I decided to speak up. It started when my mom asked about my job again, the way she always does. So how is your little business going? She said with that fake sweet smile that always carries hidden knives. I looked at her and said, it's going fine, Mom. But before I could finish, my dad interrupted, saying, come on, don't sugarcoat it. We all know it's not working out. The whole table laughed. My cousins smirked. My aunt whispered something under her breath that made my sister giggle, and I just sat there gripping my fork tighter than ever. I had been quiet too long. I had swallowed my pride for years, pretending it didn't hurt, but hearing them mock everything I built was the last straw. I looked straight at my father and asked him a question I never dared to before. Do you even know what I do? His fork stopped in midair. He frowned and said, you sell things online, right? Like those people on Facebook. Everyone chuckled again and I smiled, but not the polite kind this time. I said, Dad, I run 3 e-commerce stores that made 6 figures this year. Mom's hand froze halfway to her wine glass. My sister stopped scrolling through her phone, and even my little nephew stopped playing with his toy car. I could see disbelief written on every face at the table, but my dad didn't want to lose control, so he laughed, that forced laugh of his, saying, yeah, sure. 6 figures, huh? Maybe in Monopoly money. I leaned forward and said, then who do you think paid for this dinner? Silence again, heavy thick silence. I could almost hear their thoughts racing. I watched as my father looked down at the tablecloth, then at the turkey, then at me, like he was trying to find a hole in my words. My mother's lips trembled. She looked around like she wanted someone else to say something, anything to save her pride, but no one spoke. I continued, because for years they called me a failure for not getting a corporate job, for not following their footsteps, for not being what they wanted. But what they didn't know is that every time they called me useless, I worked harder. Every night I sat alone building something they couldn't understand. When my friends were out having fun, I was figuring out how to pay rent and keep my business alive. When I failed, I didn't quit. I just learned faster. I didn't need validation from anyone, least of all from people who never believed in me. My mom finally whispered, you paid for this dinner? I nodded, yes, Mom. Every dish on this table, every drink in your glass, every candle on this tablecloth, it's all from the business you said would never work. Her eyes filled with tears, but not the proud kind. They were the kind that comes from being exposed. My sister muttered wow under her breath. My dad stayed quiet, and for the first time in my life I saw something in his eyes that looked like respect, or maybe shame, or maybe both. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted them to know I wasn't a failure. I wanted them to see that success doesn't always come dressed in a suit or a title. It comes in persistence, in believing in yourself when no one else does. The rest of the dinner was quiet. No more jokes, no more fake smiles, just the sound of forks scraping plates and my own heartbeat calming down. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt free because I realized I didn't need their approval to feel worthy. That night when I walked out of their house, I looked back. Once my father was standing near the doorway watching me. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. I could tell that everything had changed, maybe not completely, but enough for me to finally breathe. On my way home, I thought about all those nights I wanted to quit, all those times I doubted myself, and I smiled because every struggle led to this moment when I finally proved to myself that I was never the failure they said I was. I was just the one brave enough to take a different path. The night air felt colder but lighter, like it carried away every word they ever used to bring me down, and for the first time Thanksgiving felt like my day, not theirs. When I reached home that night, I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat on the couch in the dark, the echo of that silence from the dinner table still in my head. It wasn't anger anymore, it was relief, the kind of relief that makes your chest feel lighter after years of carrying something heavy. I looked around my small apartment, the one they always mocked for being too small, too simple, too temporary, and I realized how much it meant to me. Every corner of it held pieces of my struggle, the late nights, the mistakes, the tiny victories that no one else saw. My laptop was still open on the desk, a few orders pending on the screen. The same business they called a joke, feeding families, now including theirs. I thought about how strange it is how people judge your worth by what they can see, by what sounds familiar to them. They never understood my world because it didn't fit their version of success. To them, a real job meant an office, a boss, a paycheck with a logo on top, but to me real success was freedom. It was waking up every day knowing I built something from nothing. It was not needing to beg for approval anymore. The next morning I got a text from my mom. It was short. It said breakfast tomorrow, just us. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something in me said go, so I went. She was already at the diner sitting near the window. I could tell she hadn't slept much. Her eyes looked softer, tired, but softer. She didn't start with small talk. She went straight to it. I didn't know, she said. I really didn't know how well you were doing. I smiled because she wasn't lying. They never cared enough to ask. I said it's okay. Mom, you didn't have to know. I just needed you to believe in me, even a little. She nodded, slowly staring at her coffee like she was searching for words. She said, we just wanted you to be safe, stable. We grew up thinking that was the only way to live. I said, I get it, Mom. But sometimes safety kills dreams and stability can feel like a cage. I chose uncertainty, but it gave me peace. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, I'm proud of you, and this time I believed her for the first time in years. We talked for hours about things we never talked about before, about how scared she was when Dad lost his job years ago, how that fear made her overprotective, how she pushed us so hard because she didn't want us to struggle like she did. I listened, really listened, and I realized she wasn't cruel. She was afraid. Fear makes people say things they don't mean and do things that hurt the ones they love. When we finished breakfast, she hugged me and whispered, I'm sorry. I just nodded because forgiveness doesn't always need words. Sometimes silence says enough. As I walked out of the diner, I saw my reflection in the glass door. I didn't look like the person they used to call a failure. I looked like someone who had finally found his own peace. Later that week, my dad called me, which in itself was shocking. He never called unless it was serious. His voice was heavy. He said, hey, I've been thinking about what you said at dinner. I froze, waiting for another jab, but instead he said, I guess I owe you an apology. I was wrong to judge you. I didn't understand what you were doing. I just wanted you to have an easier life. I said, it's okay, Dad. Really? He said, no, it's not okay. I should have supported you. You worked hard, and I didn't see it. I stayed quiet because hearing that from him felt unreal. He said, maybe you can show me sometime how all that online stuff works. I laughed a little. Yeah, sure, Dad, anytime. And that was the first real conversation we'd had in years. A few months later, when the holidays came again, I wasn't nervous about seeing them. I actually looked forward to it. I arrived early, helped Mom in the kitchen. She didn't make any passive remarks about my life this time. She just asked for help setting the table. Dad came in carrying drinks. He looked awkward for a moment, then said, hey champ, glad you made it. I smiled and said, glad to be here. The dinner went smoothly. No tension, no comparisons, just laughter and old stories, and for the first time it felt like a family again. Halfway through dinner, my dad raised his glass and said, to second chances, to believing in your kids even when you don't understand them. Everyone clinked glasses, and I couldn't help but feel my throat tighten. That night I realized something powerful. Sometimes people need to be shown, not told. They need to see your strength, your growth, your results, because words don't always break walls, actions do. When I walked out that night, I stood on the porch and looked up at the stars, remembering all those times I felt invisible and worthless, and how far I'd come from that. The journey wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about proving to myself that I could rise no matter who doubted me, because the truth is, your worth isn't decided at a dinner table. It's built in silence and struggle, in every choice you make when no one's watching. I got in my car, turned on the engine and smiled, because for the first time in a long time, home didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like peace. The next morning I woke up before sunrise. My phone was buzzing with new orders, new messages, new life. My business was growing faster than I imagined, and yet all I could think about was how quiet my mind felt after years of chaos. I brewed my coffee and sat by the window watching the world wake up, and I thought about how much can change when you stop letting other people define who you are. For so long I lived inside their words: failure, disappointment, waste of potential, but those labels only stuck because I believed them. Once I stopped believing them, they lost power. I realized that night at Thanksgiving wasn't just a victory moment, it was a turning point. It was me closing a chapter of needing validation from people who never tried to understand me. I had built something with my bare hands through nights of fear and mornings of doubt, and now I was finally able to breathe without asking if I was enough. Weeks passed, and I noticed my relationship with my parents started to heal in small, quiet ways. Mom would call sometimes just to ask how I was doing, not how my business was doing, just me. Dad started sending me articles about entrepreneurship, trying to understand my world better. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One Sunday, he even asked if he could invest a little in one of my stores. I laughed at first, but he was serious. He said, maybe I can learn something from you. I told him, you already did, Dad. You learned that success doesn't have one shape. He nodded slowly and said, you're right, son. I used to think I had all the answers, but I guess I didn't. I smiled, because that was something I'd waited my whole life to hear. One evening I was driving back from a warehouse visit when my phone rang. It was my sister. She never called much, so I answered quickly. She said, "Hey, just wanted to say I'm proud of you. You really turned things around." I laughed and said thanks, but she said, "No, really, I mean it. You gave Mom and Dad hope again. They talk about you all the time now," and I could hear the emotion in her voice. She said, "I used to think you were lost, but now I realize you were just ahead of your time." That line hit deep. It reminded me how often people confuse different with wrong, how they label dreamers as failures just because their path doesn't fit the map. They know. That night I sat in my car for a long time thinking about how close I had come to giving up, how many times I almost believed I wasn't good enough, and how different life would be if I had quit. Months turned into a year, and that next Thanksgiving was different. There was laughter, warmth, and not a trace of judgment. Mom insisted on cooking my favorite dish. Dad carved the turkey with a big grin, and at one point he raised his glass again, this time looking straight at me. He said, "Last year my son taught me a lesson, one I'll never forget. He taught me that failure is not falling short, it's not trying at all." And I realized I'd rather have a son who dreams too big than one who never dreams at all. Everyone clapped and I felt my chest tighten again, but this time it was pride, not pain. When dinner ended, Mom pulled me aside, hugged me, and said, "Thank you for never giving up on yourself or on us." I whispered back, "Thank you for finally seeing me." And in that moment, all the years of tension melted away. Later that night, after everyone left, I stayed behind to help clean up. Dad came over, handed me a glass of water, and said, "You know, son, I was thinking maybe next year we host Thanksgiving at your place." I smiled and said, "Sure, Dad, you just want me to pay again, right?" He laughed, that real laugh this time, and said, "Maybe, but at least now I know who I'm thanking for it." We both laughed, and for the first time it didn't feel forced, it felt real. Driving home that night, I rolled down the window, let the cold air hit my face, and I couldn't stop smiling. I thought about how strange life is, how sometimes you have to break apart to come back together stronger. I wasn't the same person who sat at that dinner table being mocked and belittled. A life from the ashes of doubt. I learned that success is not about money or status, it's about freedom and peace. It's about walking into a room full of people who once doubted you and realizing you don't need to prove anything anymore because your life already does that for you. I learned that forgiveness is the final stage of success, because until you forgive, you're still chained to the past that tried to define you. As I parked my car, I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror and whispered to myself, "You did it." Not to brag, not to boast, but to remind myself of the journey, the sleepless nights, the rejections, the quiet tears that no one saw. I walked into my apartment, the same small place, but somehow it felt bigger now, lighter. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and smiled at the open orders, not because of the money, but because of what they represented. Every click, every purchase, every customer was a reminder that the world had room for me even when my family once didn't. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and thought about that one night that changed everything, the night they called me a failure and I reminded them who paid for dinner.